Devil Never Cry.
Never played a Devil May Cry? Don't know where to possibly start? Well, you're certainly in the right place. What is up everyone, it is me DevilNeverCry, and this video should serve as a guide to newcomers of the Devil May Cry series as I go over the merits of each and every game in the series, ultimately helping you choose which title to start your DMC journey with. So without further ado, let's dive right in. Hold on just a second, are you a fan of DMC already? If so, you should definitely like this video and consider subscribing. Not only does it help out the channel with the algorithm, but it means you won't miss out on anything and everything Devil May Cry. Kicking things off, we have the original Devil May Cry. The game debuted in 2001 and can be considered the genesis point for the character action genre. This game has you take control of Dante as he makes his way to Malay Island and fights his way through 23 missions of literal hell. As almost all of you likely have heard by now, the Devil May Cry series originally started out as a Resident Evil game, and DMC 1 wears this influence on its sleeve. Compared to some of the later games in the series, DMC 1 can technically be considered slow, though personally I prefer to use the term methodical. There's more of a focus on exploration as you soak in the gothic horror atmosphere of Malay Castle, but ultimately this game is just as tight as the games that followed. The controls feel responsive and the gameplay overall is tight and snappy. Dante doesn't have many toolkits in his arsenal to make use of when destroying enemies, but the ones that he does have make the gameplay feel cathartic overall. This game is no slouch when it comes to difficulty either. If you don't pay attention and take care as to what you're doing, you can find yourself staring at that game over screen numerous times. Though, as I previously mentioned, this game is over 20 years old, and as such, some have labeled the game as dated, and I can't fault them. The game features a fixed camera angle perspective, which when paired with fast frenetic combat or interesting platforming sections can make things feel more frustrating than they really need to be. If you're also going into this expecting to hear about the epic of a half-human, half-devil and their plight to save the world, you can guess again. This game is rather light on its story, choosing to focus mostly on its gameplay to do the talking instead. That nicely and neatly brings us on to DMC 2. The supposed black sheep of the Devil May Cry series. This game dropped in 2003 and has a bit of a reputation. Choosing not to build off of what made the original Devil May Cry so great, DMC 2 instead throws a rather stoic Dante into an industrial and urban setting. Long gone is the tight-knit gothic horror environment which could potentially be considered a character in and of itself. Instead, you're thrown into a wide, cavernous, barren city that is devoid of all life, much to the detriment of the game. Enemies and bosses don't really pose a threat all too much, and Dante no longer has access to multiple melee weapons and interesting purchasable moves. Instead, Dante has style. His devilish drip in DMC 2 has his outfit crowned as the best outfit out of the entire series by most of the fans. Along with that though, Devil May Cry 2 did introduce a few interesting aspects into the rest of the series. The first of which is a customizable devil trigger, which unfortunately is only seen in DMC 2. We also have the Bloody Palace, a recurring special mode which has you take on wave after wave after wave of devils. Live weapon switching, as you're able to swap out your firearms on the fly, and last but certainly not least, the style button. Dante's able to pull off a myriad of context-sensitive wall runs, ducks, and dodges thanks to the style button they introduced in DMC 2. That brings us on to Devil May Cry 3 Special Edition. Most people consider this the best game in the franchise, and a majority of people out there consider this one of the best action games of all time, and having played through it a numerous amount of times, it's hard to argue against that fact. DMC 3 serves as a direct chronological prequel to the original Devil May Cry, featuring the coming-of-age story of Dante himself and his twin brother Virgil. This is the game that took the combat of DMC to a whole new level, allowing you to switch out between multiple weapons on the fly, coupled with a distinct style system which allows Dante to make use of a variety of different context-sensitive moves. The sky's the limit with a combat system such as this, and though that may seem daunting to a newcomer, you can simply stick to the weapons and styles that you know and love, and they'll get you through the game quite easily. Like the original Devil May Cry, if you don't pay attention and make sure to learn the basic mechanics of DMC3, you're going to be in for a very rough ride. This game features some of the toughest bosses in the series, but if you can take the time to learn them, figure out what makes them tick, the combat against them will be that much more enjoyable. It's also worth mentioning that compared to the previous games, DMC3 is chock full of story and cutscenes. This game will let you learn a lot about the world and characters of Devil May Cry. Then we have Devil May Cry 4, an incredibly divisive game, the game that pushed the series into the HD era. Plagued with a lot of development growing pains, many call DMC4 half a game, and unfortunately, it does show. The game is fraught with non-stop backtracking, substantial reuse of bosses, and annoying puzzles. That aside, however, Devil May Cry 4 has again one of the best combat systems of all time. Dante's quite literally stepped his game up, as he's now able to switch between all 4 styles on the fly, and all of his weapons all at once. Couple that with a new playable character in the form of Nero, the foul-mouthed, angsty, brash Knight of the Order of the Sword, and this game can be quite daunting for a newcomer, especially as you spend the first half playing as Nero and just about coming to grips with all of his mechanics and what he has in his toolkit, only to be then thrown into the shoes of Dante. Speaking of being thrust into something, it's time to talk about the reboot. I did say DMC2 was the black sheep of the DMC series, but perhaps it's the reboot instead. The reboot dramatically changes quite literally everything. The entire story and origin of Devil May Cry and the Sons of Sparda, the gameplay, the control scheme, the characters, the music, the setting, quite literally everything. Surprisingly, in a shock turn of events, it also gives us a fully controllable camera, a first in the series. Think of this game as a more gritty, urban, quite literally Western approach to Devil May Cry. Dante's foul-mouthed and wields his devil may care attitude like a weapon itself. On the combat side of things, the game does a wonderful job of easing the player into new weapons and new mechanics. The game also introduces into the series for the first time a training mode, allowing players and newcomers to get to grips with weapons they've just obtained or moves they've just bought, and overall does a good job of acclimating a player to the speed of the combat. A focus on exploration and platforming also return in the reboot, but thankfully we don't have to contend with fixed camera angles. And last but certainly not least, we have Devil May Cry 5. The game that brought the DMC series back from the dead. The latest entry in the series, DMC5 takes a multitude of different gameplay aspects from all of the previous DMC games and refines and polishes them, taking a few aspects from the reboot itself as well, for good measure. Capcom went to great lengths to make this game approachable and accessible to newcomers, simply because it's the first game back after a lengthy hiatus, and they really wanted anybody and everybody to get stuck into this game. Though considering from a story perspective, this essentially is the crescendo, the climax or finale of the Sons of Sparda saga, and as such isn't probably the best place for a newcomer to start. And on that topic, I've talked about each and every game at length, and so it's time for my verdict. I ultimately suggest that if you're a newcomer, you should start with the original Devil May Cry. Sure, there are a few things that may be slightly dated, but ultimately, the game still holds up incredibly well. The game is also incredibly short, allowing you to blitz through it quite quickly. If you do decide to stop midway through, I highly suggest you skip past DMC2 for the time being and move on to DMC3 and continue to play the rest of the games in chronological release order. The reason I don't suggest starting with a very beginner-friendly game like the reboot or DMC5 is because if you opt to then go back and play some of the older games, you might find some of them slightly more dated, and that's only because each game builds incrementally over what the previous did, perfecting certain aspects and then adding to them. Though some may suggest starting from DMC2, considering it the rock bottom in which you can only go up from, ultimately there is a chance that that game might infuriate you to the point where you never want to touch any of the other games in the series, and as such, I suggest you play that game well into your tenure as a Devil May Cry player. And with that, we come to the end of this video. Let me know what your first Devil May Cry game was down in the comments below. And with all that said and done, it has been me, DevilNeverCry. I'd like to thank all of you for watching, and as always, I'll see you all next video.